Welcome to Future Histories. My name is Jan Groos, and it is my great pleasure to welcome Jacob Blumenfeld in today's episode. He is a principal investigator in the research project Socialization in Theory and Practice at the Center for Social Critique at Humboldt University, Berlin. Jacob has done and is still doing fantastic work on socialization, some of which we will definitely touch upon in our conversation today. Mostly, however, we will talk about a series of excellent articles and essays Jacob wrote about ecological questions such as climate barbarism, adapting to a wrong world, and a recent article titled Managing Decline. Before we start, I want to express my immense joy that our edited volume, Democratic Planning in the 21st Century and Beyond, which I edited together with Christoph Sorg, is now officially released. I'll put the link to the book in the show notes, together with a link to a book release event that will take place on March 4th at 7 o'clock in the Aquarium in Berlin. Please come and join. Many thanks actually to Jacob Blumenfeld, who helped organize this event, and a funny coincidence. Another funny coincidence is that I today sat together with Christoph Sorg in a workshop on democratic ecological planning, and I took the chance to record a small intro with Christoph in order to celebrate the release of the book, which is why we will now switch in full promo mode for a second. I have the great pleasure to announce that finally, our edited volume, Democratic Planning in the 21st Century and Beyond, is now out in the open. You can buy it, read it, enjoy it. And to my great pleasure, Christoph Sorg, co-editor of this very volume, sits right next to me. Hello, Christoph.
Hi, Jan.
So, Christoph, what do we offer in this book?
First of all, I'm really happy that the book is out. It's been a lot of work. I think what the book really offers is two things. So for people who really want to find out what this whole planning debate is about, it offers a really good introduction, but also advanced information. So it's just a lot of insights on what's going on in this planning literature. And for the people that are already well-versed in the planning literature, it offers a bunch of theoretical extensions. What an ecological perspective on planning is, what a social reproductive theory perspective on planning is, how we think about transformation. So it fills a lot of gaps, really, I think, at the same time as introducing the debate. And also planning, which is the theme of the book. Planning is not going to go away. We're going to need to plan a lot of things for socio-ecological transformation. The poly crisis means that we have to plan a lot of things. Already in parts of the world, also in ours, increasingly a lot of things are being planned differently than before. So this is a really important political topic. So it's not really far out there in the future, abstract. It's really something that's a really important contemporary topic. So we hope a lot of people will engage with the theme of planning and maybe bring in ideas of what political projects could look like, what this could mean for current contentious politics and so on. So yeah, happy to engage on those topics.
And maybe just to plug this very shamelessly and bluntly, if anybody's interested in writing a review about the book, how would they go about it?
Easiest way would be to just contact us so we can facilitate that you get a review copy of the book. And yeah, just contact us if you want to do that.
Yeah, contact us. I think this goes even beyond the book. If you're interested in the debate, please contact us.
No, only for reviews.
So yeah, I think this is really something we can celebrate. I think it's an excellent volume, if I may say so. Thank you, Christoph, for this absolutely fantastic collaboration. I really very much enjoyed it. I want to say that
likewise,
very explicitly.
Thank you. The feeling is mutual.
Yeah, and I very much look forward to many different other projects, some of which we already are engaged in together. Maybe just as a final ask to all of the listeners, if you're interested in this debate, please tell other people about it. Tell other people about the book, maybe, or first take a look at the book, and then if you enjoy it, recommend it. I think word of mouth is one of the most important elements in all of this. And now, please enjoy today's episode with Jacob Blumenfeld on climate barbarism and managing decline. Welcome, Jacob.
Thank you, Jan. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Yes, I mean, we wanted to record an episode for like 2 years now, I think, and I'm very happy that it's happening now.
Good.
So,
good.
Jacob, you wrote a text titled Managing Decline, and in it you write, and I quote, "We are inheriting a broken world. We need to let it down gently. We no longer need to abolish it, since it's already abolishing itself. Our task in the present and the future is rather to manage its decline." End quote. So, what do you mean by managing decline?
Yeah, I think it's pretty obvious that we're going through a phase of decline, in a sense, right? And the question is, what kind of decline are we going through? I mean, Trump's inauguration speech was all about reversing decline, right? That was the big headline. Stop the decline of America. I mean, stopping the decline of Europe is also a big theme right now. Understand how to deal with the decline of the auto industry, for instance. What I'm focusing on in this article is not these grand narratives of, decline of the West, which have been circulating for centuries in Spengler and before. I'm not interested in this aesthetics of decline. The decadence theory that, Western societies have become corrupt and immoral and they're going for decline. I'm interested in a couple of different conceptions of decline, particularly the decline of fossil capitalism. So the decline of fossil fuel-based society, that is a decline that needs to happen, right? So it's something that we need to think about, call for, and manage. Right? Without managing this process of bringing down this, I would say, world relation that has built up our, sense of self for a long time, our sense of relationships, our sense of understanding. Without managing this, it will have chaotic and dangerous effects and reactive and aggressive reactions to it. So to manage it means to think about how to transition, right, in a way that's non-harmful or non-destructive. A counterexample would be, deindustrialization, which is a kind of unmanaged decline, right, for many cases, right? It's just in which towns go bankrupt or people get thrown out of work because capital moves to cheaper locations for more exploitable labor. You could think of the decline of fossil capitalism as something that can also be just following the whims of the market. I think that would be very dangerous. Or following a couple powerful states that try to become the new hegemons. These are all the possibilities of managing decline or unmanaged decline I see in the future. So I think it's the task of people who want a human society to take it seriously, this project of this world coming to an end. Not the world, but a particular kind of world, or you could even say a world relation. And once you start from that framework, a lot of problems arise, and that can motivate us to think through, okay, who are the people that are dependent on fossil fuel jobs, on fossil fuel inputs to their existence? What are the kinds of values we hold in a fossil capitalist society that would need to be changed? And not just, flipped, but, when you manage the decline of an industry or of a way of life, that's something that has to be done with care, patience, space for grief, mourning, in a sense, mourning of a loss. I think these are valuable expressions and almost necessary feelings that have to be given their space. And and usually when we talk about this transition, it's very economistic. It's like, okay, what are the new inputs and outputs? How's the financial markets going to invest? How are we going to push investments from brown to green fuels? So it's at the macro level of the economy or of states. And I'm thinking, what about these subjective factors that if we do not manage? I'm also, of course, interested in the macro factors, but there's a relation between the subjective and the objective processes going on. And without taking care of both, you get to pathologies, right? You get to resentment. You get to green backlash or backlash against this decline that can, demand to make America or make Europe great again. And I find that very dangerous. You get, kinds of reaction formations that are predictable when you rip out the subjective and objective buffers that create our self-identity. And I think fossil fuels are a big buffer, right? Not just in terms of, the energy that's coming into our electricity, but the kinds of products that we live upon. The petroleum-based products that we live upon in our homes, in our apartments, our houses, our bikes, our bags, our soaps, our hair products, our clothing. So I think that's it's a serious question that I think has not got so much discussion. And I don't mean thinking about it as just a consumer, like we need to change our consumer habits to the right products. I think that's also a bit too quick, right? It's changing our sense of, world relation.
We will certainly get to the part of how what you, I think, call fossil subjectivities is being a big part of this, and how this world relation, as you rightly point out, needs to change, and that we need to think about how these subjectivities can become different somewhat. We will get to this point. Before we get there, I would have some more or less kind of practical questions maybe regarding the term managing decline, or this phrase of managing decline, because it holds managing in it. So usually when we talk about managing, there's a certain association in terms of a hierarchical nature of there being a manager who manages the stuff, and we are mostly on the receiving end of this managed constellation. So why did you opt for the term managing when you speak about what we will have to engage with as a positive project as well? Because I do understand kind of critiquing what I think you also call climate barbarism, or the way in which like dominant powers try to have a very technocratic, hierarchical, top-down approach towards this question of adapting to climate change. And in this context, it would be more intuitive to speak of management. But then also I have to think about Yevgeny Morozov, who also kind of approaches this question of an alternative imaginary through the lens of the idea of management, or how to manage things. So I would be interested in how you think about this idea of managing with regard to this idea of managing decline.
Yeah, I take the term from Holly Jean Buck, who uses it in her book, her 2021 book, Ending Fossil Fuels. She kind of uses this term, managing decline, managing retreat of fossil fuels, as kind of a process that needs to be thought out on a political, economic, technological, and psychological level. And she talks about but she's very specific about managing the decline of, certain kinds of activities we do, like or certain kind of places where we live, and kind of managing a retreat from places that are not livable anymore, or products that are not usable anymore. And what I thought when I read this concept, I thought it kind of spoke to a broader understanding. So I kind of took this idea that Buck uses and expanded it. I'm interested in planning, right, at a broader level of how do you plan society and plan economy without the market, without money. But I thought planning decline didn't sound the same. It doesn't really make the same kind of sense. Planning to me is a more coordinated, not necessarily top down. Of course, it can be democratic, but a more a broader project, right? Managing, I think, is this double sense where it could be like you said, a hierarchical project of a manager and their company, or for instance, which is, there's also a lot of economic literature on managing the decline of industries, which you could find in management books. But managing also has to do with your life, at least in English, right? So how do you manage your life? Are you managing your life well? And I don't think this is just managing your life like a company, right? It's not like I'm just an entrepreneur of myself. I think it's managing your life is how are you managing your time? How are you managing your responsibilities is usually the way that the term is thought. Are you managing your responsibilities well? Are you managing your time well? This is what a therapist might say to you, or a parental figure, or friends when they're worried about you. Are you managing? Right? They just say, are you managing? And I think that points to something true about the concept as well in English, that it's about how do you negotiate difficulty? How do you incorporate difficulty, hardship, and trade-offs into your subjective life as well. It also has the subjective factor though, right? Are you managing your time schedules? Are you managing your time-work balance? Are you managing the family? There's a problem with the term though, that it has this inherent, almost, you could say it sounds a bit technocratic, right? But I think it goes both ways. It flips both ways. And I like that ambiguity of the very concept of managing, right? So this managing oneself, managing this change that we're going through as individuals in this changing society, but also managing this decline of this kind of economy at the same time. And I don't think the word planning gets that. When we talk about planning my time, doesn't have the same sense of, or planning myself doesn't have the same sense. And I can't think of another word that does either. There is like this hierarchical danger, right? Who is being managed and who is managing, that you pointed to. But I think that could be reversible, right? That's not necessarily hard. It's not fixed. People can, depending on the frame you use, we're all managing decline in our different ways.
And maybe to even expand on this question in a different way, a little bit more in the direction of, let's say, a narrative or an imaginary, even a positive imaginary. I was kind of asking myself how you try to situate this notion of managing decline as a positive project, let's say, because I mean, intuitively, when I read your text and when it came to the phrase managing decline, I took some notes and I wrote next to it, non-libidinal position, defeatist attitude. And I don't mean this in an offensive way. I'm sorry if it comes across like that. I mean, there is this, let's say, danger, because it's interesting. You spoke of managing retreat and this also has this double function. It's about managing retreat in the sense of we won't be able to live in certain places anymore because it's just not inhabitable anymore. But also, there's this notion of retreat in the sense of retreating from a more, maximalist position, maybe. A position that argues much more for something than against something, that argues for a positive project and not like for merely managing decline, one could say, so there is this danger in this phrase that it might not be able to kind of win people over, let's say, because the right, they have like shitty ideas and shitty concepts, but they do package them as if they had a positive vision of a better future, and this is kind of important, I guess, in the sense of providing an attractive imaginary of an alternative, whatever that might be in a given case, and this idea of managing decline kind of runs the risk of coming across as a defeatist position, let's say. I'm not saying that you use it that way, because I think it's very it totally makes sense to describe it as ending things or providing the ability to end things. I think that's a very, very powerful narrative part in it as well. But in the overall picture, I think it's still you would have to kind of ask, or one would have to ask, why we should form our imaginary of the future around this kind of notion of decline and managing decline in that sense.
Yeah, you're right. There's a danger of if this is a kind of a rallying cry or a slogan, it can be very insular, and it can signify retreating to a closed community to defend your resources or your goods in the face of decline, right? So we're going through some kind of decline. So what we do is we come together to protect each other, and that's very non-transformative, right? That's non-emancipatory, if you think of it like that. It's a way of retreating, declining, and in so doing, making sure we take care of each other in the process. That is a self-protection, right? Or what Philip Staub says, that's adaptation, that's Anpassung, right? Or Selbsterhaltung. This is just self-protection and adaptation, and I think that is one thing to be, that's one tendency to be worried of. And I take that seriously. Thankfully, I'm not using this as a rallying cry, right? It's not a slogan to rally the masses. What I'm trying to say is that managed decline should be, and has to be part of a positive vision of the future, right? So I think managing decline is it's one way of thinking what a transformative vision of the future will have to incorporate. You don't have to use the terms if you don't want to, but you have to understand. But I think the process or the content underneath the concept cannot be avoided, right? So one way of thinking about how this can be a part of a transformative and not just a reactive project, to say, okay, we want to transform our relationship to the earth, to nature, in a way that's not mediated by fossil fuel inputs. To me, that's a massive project of reorganizing labor, of redistributing our capacity, our labor power, around different, geographically and temporally, to think about how time and how space and how we work in time and space differently to reproduce our societies, right? That's a big project of repair, of reorganization, and that's one way, to me, of managing decline, right? So the word repair, to me, is one positive way of theorizing what this process of managing decline can look like if it's transformative, if it's based on solidarity and not based on reaction and aggression. So I think the term itself is ambivalent, right? Managing decline can be a very horrible process. It could be a harmful, destructive process that we are just living through this decline in a sense, right? We're living through the decline of American hegemony in some senses, not all of them. And we could be living through the decline of, I mean, not yet, but fossil capitalism in a very harmful and a very destructive way, right? A way that increases resentment towards people who are in the out-group, you could say, right? So any immigrants, any people who don't belong, anyone who's not seen as one of us. So what would a non-reactive kind of managing decline look like? There I could use other concepts, like repair. I would go something like that, or kind of a process of repair. There's another danger here, though. Repair sometimes presupposes that you return to a previous state that was just broken, right? So we had this relationship to nature, this relationship to each other that kind of got broken by the metabolism broke, as many people say, and we need to just repair the metabolism and fix it so we're stable again. Now, I also think that there is no stability, right, anymore. So repair in this sentence is not repairing to a previous state. I would say it's transformative repair. It's repairing our relations to each other, right? But not in a way that returns us to kind of bourgeois subjectivities, individual isolation, coming together only on contracts and markets, but in a way that transforms us in this process of repair, right? I would like to have these concepts, come together in a kind of constellation, but with realizing that, without taking this process of managing decline seriously, it'll happen without us, right? So that's why I focused on it in this text to say, okay, this is something that has to be incorporated into a positive project. I also have another name for this positive project in other texts, and that's socialization. It's the process of socializing certain goods of society and certain relationships and certain infrastructures. But that focuses on other elements of this transition, right? Here, I did want to focus on the negative in a sense, and you're right to point out, where's the positive, right? Just to, if I can go on for one more second, when we talk about transformation or democratic planning or socialization, it's usually about, positive projects of planning based on needs, supply and demand, how we want to live together, how we want to socialize the means of production, how we want to socialize the means of reproduction. The question I kind of pose here, maybe it's implicit, is how do you socialize the means of destruction, right? There are destructive forces that Marx mentions in one or two phrases, just as there are productive forces. There are kinds of technologies that are exploitive and harmful that have to be somehow dealt with. Fossil fuel-based products and energy sources are harmful to us, we know now, right? Military production, prison systems. One of my favorite philosophers, Gunther Anders, wrote a lot about the atomic bomb. And how do you deal with the atomic bomb? How do you think about it? And how do you think about our relationship to the atomic bomb? So these are just kinds of means of destruction or destructive forces that also have to be dealt with, brought into decline, in a sense, phased out in certain ways. And they cannot just be appropriated and redistributed equally, right? So it does give us a different lens on the future to focus on the negative here, right? I do not mean that this is a kind of that this is a reactive project or a project where we just kind of retreat. I think that this is a part of any transformative future, right? So working through the negative is part of this process, and not avoiding it or letting other people do it for us, right? That's why I focus on that negativity, at least here a little bit.
Yeah, and I think it totally makes sense the way that you described it right now. And I also really like the imaginary of, or the image or the notion of repair as something to point towards when it with regard to the positive elements or at least some elements of a positive imaginary. Maybe to pick up on this, because you just hinted towards that when saying that repair might be misunderstood as something, as returning to a prior state of whatever, stability, harmony, whatever, and that it's not about, having an idea of a broken metabolism with nature that then needs to be fixed, but that we need to go beyond that, and that we have to engage in a form of transformative idea and process, actually, regarding this relation. Can you point towards some of the elements that lie behind that? Because at least in the conversations that I have, there are in quite some cases these notions of either stability or boundaries, or certain notions that suggest that there could be a form of to be reached equilibrium or to be reached state of renegotiated relation regarding this social metabolism with nature. And I would be interested how you conceptualize this, if it's if one doesn't want to fall back into certain forms of essentialism with regard to thinking about these questions.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm just not sure I understand what equilibrium would mean anymore. I mean, I think,
Well,
and maybe that's my fault. Maybe that's my imagination is so damaged, right? Because we live in a damaged society. So my ideas of equilibrium are so damaged. I'm like, what would it even mean to live in equilibrium with nature? I mean, how would that? I mean, maybe that's a long-term process that would require reshifting our production so radically. But because we are so socialized, right, already, like capitalism socializes us in radical ways, in the sense that our relationships to each other, our relationships to nature are so mediated, they're so related to other human beings, other processes, other products happening around the world. That process is so dynamic and transformative already in itself, in a way that we're unconscious of, right? We cannot control. The starting to take that under our conscious control would mean having the ability to reflect and deliberate on the aims and purposes of how we want to relate to each other and how we want to relate to nature, right? But can we really pull back so much from our interdependencies on each other, from the technological, from the state of production that we have? Can we really pull back so drastically that we have some kind of, I don't know, equilibrium, right? I mean, on what scale would that even mean? Maybe it's a question of scale, right? So, in some communities or settings, you could have an equilibrium of fish in a fishery, or of trees in a forest, or of stability in terms of what kind of goods are made based on which inputs or resources you have, and that's a kind of economic equilibrium. But that can change depending on our needs transforming, right? Discovering new needs that we have might transform our equilibrium with each other and with our surrounding environment. That will produce a new equilibrium, right? I guess the question is, how can you allow for this transformation, for these new discoveries to occur without harming the basis on which we reproduce ourselves and on which our surrounding environment flourishes? I think we would need other categories, maybe than equilibrium. I would think of flourishing is a good category or criteria to think about. We could think of interests, animal interests, natural interests, human interests. Needs is a very debatable category, but to think about the needs of nature, the needs of animals, and the needs of human beings as socially dynamic processes that can be discovered, rediscovered, and changed. Now, you also mentioned the word boundaries and limits, and I think these are also things that are important to understanding, the conditions in which we live, right? So what is the state of the soil? What is the state of the oceans? What is the state of the temperature? As we know, there are no, capitalism has no boundaries, right? It'll go through any boundary we give it, right? So, and the planet will continue beyond the boundaries that we have. So what are the boundaries that are good for us, good for human beings, and good for species in general? That is both a scientific and a social process of discovery, I would say. And I wouldn't want to hold out the possibility that changes, that maybe our boundaries should be less, a lot less. Maybe they should be a little more. Maybe we have new categories that intervene. So I think these are all categories that could help direct us in terms of what would repair look like in a local project, in a project of repairing technologies to give us more renewable resources or renewable energies. I'm not sure equilibrium would be the right framework to understand that. It could be energy needs, or it could be different criteria. But in other settings, that could be a better understanding when we have a extinction of certain species or a soil fertility declining, we might want to talk about the boundaries or limits to extraction in a way that's hard and fixed. But in that sense, I'm not dogmatic about which framing is more useful for which kind of repair we're doing, right? Repairing of energy sources, repairing of natural metabolism, repairing of social metabolism might need to be differentiated according to different criteria for judging what is the best way for each one of these to flourish.
And in your previous answer, you also pointed towards this notion of adaptation. You referenced Philipp Stab's book, Anpassung. And this notion of adaptation is kind of closely attached to the notion of managing decline somewhat, I would say. And there has been a shift in the way adaptation is being conceived or perceived on the left, it seems. At least that's how I perceive it. It's still being criticized in what Wim Carton and Andreas Malm call muscular adaptation, meaning a hierarchical, ultimately still profit-driven form of adaptation. But there's also a growing sense that the fight against prevention has been lost and that there needs to be a strategic reorientation. And at least for me, it seemed as if adaptation has gone through a certain type of shift there, because we will certainly still have to fight against the notion of adaptation as an excuse for business as usual, but we will also have to think about adaptation as an element of left politics, I think, or at least that's how it seemed when I recorded the episode with Andreas Malm, who at least it seemed to me kind of switched to a position where adaptation is the wording that is now being accepted, since prevention has not really succeeded, so to speak. Yeah? So I would be interested, what's your take on adaptation? Has the sentiment changed regarding the notion of adaptation? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, we cannot prevent climate change anymore, but we can minimize it, right? We can minimize it and we can slow it down. But as we can see already around us, it's happening. And that means adaptation has to happen with it. I think for a long time, adaptation has been a way of avoiding mitigation, avoiding confronting the sources of global heating. And say, okay, listen, we can't do anything, so let's just, start developing new technologies to adapt. So that means, already giving up the battle before it even began. We just kind of adapt our social or subjective expectations to this new. This new world with a bit more suffering in it, which is kind of just what happens in capitalism, right? We just adapt our expectations towards lower wages, towards higher rents, towards worse infrastructure. We just adapt our expectations because what else is there, in a sense? We're so we're so impotent to transform such large structures around our lives that we adapt. And climate change is then kind of put on top of that. Okay, you just also have to adapt to the weather. It's like, your wages are low, your rent's too high, well, it's also too hot. Deal with it. That's one way of thinking about adaptation that is, I think, strong and becoming more dominant, and naturalizes socially produced disasters. It naturalizes catastrophe in a sense. Which we now know natural catastrophes are not just natural, right? But there's another kind of adaptation, right? So what would it mean to push for kinds of adaptation that are, I would think, not privatized, not outsourced onto individuals, or not just technologically mediated by large companies that want to sell you, new ways of working indoors when it's so hot. Or want to sell you masks for going outside and when it's wildfire smoke everywhere, right? The best mask so you can still take your baby for a walk, even though the sky is orange. That's I think the wrong kind of adaptation. What would it mean to do collective forms of adaptation that struggle together to take care of each other, and also confront the sources of misery. Now, I think what Malm and Carton talk about is, the struggle it's not like mitigation goes away. It just, the field expands, right? So adaptation is now included in climate conflicts. And Andreas and Carton and Wim, they point to Valencia as what they call the first adaptation struggle, or maybe it's France in the Megabassine struggle. These kind of adaptation struggles of how do we adapt. Usually a politician comes after a disaster. Trump flies to North Carolina and says, oh, sorry, we'll give some more money, but there's no major struggle that emerges. The question is, will struggles now emerge after climate disasters in which people come together to demand change, and if they don't get it, they take action into their own hands through strikes, through occupations, through protests, through parliamentary or extra-parliamentary means. Now, that's still kind of adaptation, or that's struggles for struggles against the state or against big business to take into consideration the needs of those who suffer catastrophes more. The adaptation I talk about in my text is a bit, it's not just about struggles, right? It's not just about adaptive struggles that occur. It's about the society itself. So even when there is no climate catastrophe, right, we still have to manage the decline of a fossil world and the fossil subjects and fossil objects and fossil energy sources. We still have to manage that decline. And but we have to do so. I mean, this is my problem with the concept of adaptation. We are adapting to a new situation, right? But this situation doesn't exist yet, right? I don't just think we need to adapt to the weather. We don't want to adapt to giving up the struggle. We want to adapt to a new world that doesn't exist yet. We want to adapt to a way of relating to each other that does not reproduce the sources of global heating, does not reproduce biodiversity extinction, does not reproduce the kinds of exploitation that we have to each other. So I'm not sure if adaptation is like that, because when Staub uses the word, or when other people use the word, it's usually adapting to a given, right? And I'm saying the given of the decline that we have to manage is not there yet, right? It's in the process. It's being formed positively, and that's what we have to adapt to. This non-existent future. But this non-existent, this way of organizing our social reproduction without fossil fuels has tons of different possibilities, right? It could just be green capitalism, right? It could be just reproducing the same kind of structures we have, just with different energy sources. It could be, islands of renewable energy within kind of larger structures of fossil fuel energy still. It could be decentralized networks of energy production. It could be centralized structures. It could be different kinds of products we use, different kinds of labor necessary, different kinds of training, different ideas of freedom that are not based on, suburban houses or cars. It could be lots of different things, right? And that's what I think we should adapt to, right? This, to that which has not yet come.
So there's a double task. We need to simultaneously adapt and bring about. And since we are simultaneously also bringing about something new, we will, on the one hand, have to adapt to the catastrophes to come, because they will come inevitably, but also at the same time bring about and learn and adapt to other forms of relating to each other and to nature, so to speak. No, so there's a double task. Maybe then, just because this is something I'm really interested in, and I think it's pretty crucial also. If we think about that, which you just framed and sketched, with regard to this question of imaginary, or let's keep it that way, imaginary, what would be the carrier for such a project in terms of narrative and imaginary in a broader sense? We already pointed towards this idea of repair. Now you sketched an element of a different type of adaptation, but I'm interested in something that can be used in order for people who are exhausted, frustrated, like really being desperate in a sense. What can there be in terms of this positive imaginary that can help not to kind of flip into this notion of defeatism that I try to point towards? Because at least in my perception, this is a real danger on the left, and specifically on the ecologically minded left, because there was a fight and people got destroyed. And it's really hard and it's really difficult to cope with. And so there is some form of totally understandable tendency to kind of let yourself go into this realm of like desperation and defeatism, so to speak, not to be harsh about it. I totally understand that. I can get it. And it's okay too, but it's also not something that kind of helps if we all go there, so there needs to be something else. There needs to be this positive element, and I'm hopefully not repeating myself, but I think you already sketched, this repair element, now the adaptation. Do you think that this is the carrier plus some form of socialization of nature, as well as you pointed out, socialization of the destructive forces of capitalism? Is this the whole package? Do we have that? Do you have can you put a tag on it to be a bit marketing sensey about it?
Yeah, I think socialization would be the third aspect here.
Right.
That kind of is a framework for understanding a project that's both a process of transition and a goal. But before I talk about socialization, since you focus so much on imagination and the imaginary, I just want to bring up one problem that needs to be confronted before we can get to socialization, which is again, I'm going to return to Gunther Anders. In his 1956 book, Die Querheit just mentioned, The Obsolescence of Human Beings, he writes about this gap between our ability to produce things and our ability to imagine what we are actually producing. He calls this the Promethean gap. He says we are producing the world in so many complex ways. Not all of us, right? Some people are producing so many technologically developed products and machines, apparatuses. Atomic bomb is one of them. But there's so many kinds of productive forces that we're producing that we cannot even imagine or conceive of what we are producing really anymore. No one has a kind of total grasp of the machine, of the objects, of the apparatus. No one has a grasp of all the parts, of how it all works. And furthermore, it's hard to even grasp the moral consequences, right? Of what we are doing, right? So we're behind. Our imagination is now behind our actions, and that's the gap he describes as this gap between what we're doing and what we're thinking. And the way to overcome this gap, if we don't overcome this gap, then we'll keep on producing and creating things that could be destructive or productive, but we don't really have the capacity to even to catch up to it, right? We're behind our technologies, as we could see, right? Whenever kind of a new AI or a new product emerges, these ethical questions kind of follow behind very slowly, and they hire some new AI ethicist to stamp whatever is happening. But so this is the first kind of obstacle, right? To overcome this gap between doing and imagining, between making and conceiving. And to do that, according to Anders, we need to expand our moral horizons, expand our moral imagination, right? To incorporate these productive and destructive forces into our self-understanding, and therefore we can think about how to use them, how to use these objects, how not to use them. What things should we not use that we build? What things do we build that we're not building today? I find that a kind of powerful, just a framework for understanding the problem of imagination in times when we're so productive, right? I mean, it's incredible how productive our society is in terms of kinds of objects. But whether we actually need these things or whether we understand what they're doing to each other is debatable, right? We don't really know what the smartphone is doing to our minds, to our bodies, to our sense of solitude and self. We should probably think about that. Now, one way that, one proposal that can, I think, help overcome this gap between knowing and producing is what I and many others for a long time have called socialization. And I know you've talked about this on your show a lot, so it's nothing new to you or to your guests. It's mostly a German and Austrian discussion right now. The idea is, what would it mean to socialize certain realms of life, sectors of social reproduction, transform them to bring them under conscious control of democratic bodies, whether workers and consumers or scientists or politicians or whatever the kind of structure someone has. Socialization is that process of transforming and reappropriating the basic infrastructures into a kind of conscious plan for sometimes managing our needs, right, or discovering our needs, or to, in a sense, with destructive forces, to managing the decline, right, of what would it mean to manage the decline of the oil industry, right, through socializing it. That's one way of bringing these kind of topics together. So socializing the oil industry would not mean, creating a more productive oil industry. It'd be helping stop it in a way that doesn't destroy the livelihoods of those who depend on it. It doesn't throw into chaos the energetic infrastructure, like the energy basis of our production. Can the market do that on its own? I mean, according to Brett Christophers, no, it cannot, right? According to many people, the market has not done that. It will not do it on its own. Can states do it on their own? I mean, this is the one big gamble. Many people think, large states have the power and the authority to shut down these industries, and actually the only authority to, right? Individuals cannot just stop an industry. They could block it as many times as they want, like Ende Gelände does and other groups, but shutting it down requires laws, right? And laws are authorized by states. The only problem is it doesn't look like any states are really doing this. Sometimes the opposite, right? Ramping up oil production, drill, 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 is what Trump says. I mean, even China, it's incredibly productive in renewable energy, but also in coal. So socialization is a third way between market-based and state-based in terms of what it means for society, for social actors to expropriate industry or a factory or a sector or a infrastructure, and rethink how it is run, rethink what the purpose is, rethink whether it's useful, based on criteria that can be collectively chosen. Criteria can be climate criteria, land criteria, the criteria of the workers who work there. So socialization would be that project of transitioning, of reappropriation of the property relations of specific, say, sectors, and reshaping them towards something like a common good or public good. And it's open what that means concretely, because there are for a couple of reasons. On the one hand, different goods, and by good I mean like housing is a good, energy is a good. Different kinds of goods, different kinds of goods have different property relations and maybe have different kinds of needs or different kinds of characteristics that would require different ways of managing and thinking about them. So how you socialize the oil industry could be different than how you want to socialize healthcare, if that's something to be done, right? Or how you socialize housing is not the same as how you socialize land. This will require thinking about the specificities of these different goods and sectors in which we live, and then taking that into account, right? Or socializing nature, which I talk about. What would it mean to incorporate ecosystems as relevant actors with interests or with needs into how we manage land or diets? Now, in Germany, the socialization is guaranteed in the constitution. I mean, in the basic law, even though it's not really implemented. But there, it's not just a German idea or an Austrian idea. I mean, there are projects to transform and socialize land and energy all over the world at different scales, and I think it potentially it's open enough to incorporate many futures within it, right? But it's also concrete enough that it can be demanded and acted upon in the present. So I think there's a lot of there's a lot of possibility to rethink what socialization means as kind of this transitionary process, right? One that's not just a means to an end, right? It's not just like in a lot of the democratic planning literature, socialization is just a step. So you go through socialization, that means you transfer property titles from private to public, or from private to collective, and then you're at the real problem, which is democratic planning, which is the information problem, which is coordinating supply and need, supply and demand, and then you're dealing with the real nitty-gritty stuff. What I want to say is, well, the socialization process is more complex and more complicated than just a property transition. It's not just a shift in ownership. It's a rethinking of our relationship to these goods, which then can allow for these questions of democratic planning to emerge within them. But it cannot just be skipped over as if an authority can just switch the sign from privately owned coal to publicly owned coal is now socialized coal, and therefore socialized coal is better. Which is already a critique that Otto Neurath made 100 years ago. So it's nothing new what I'm saying, right? These are old ideas. They've been around for a while, sometimes lost, sometimes found. And I think there is benefit in rediscovering and giving them new life again. If we find out after years of discussing and years of trying that this fails, I'm also open to new ones, right? But I think for now there is enough motivation and momentum and possibility in this project of socialization that I don't think we should give up on it yet.
Absolutely not. We should definitely pursue this path. I would like to kind of pick up on something that you just mentioned. You said socialization is much more complex, but then you also pointed out it's also, at least that's how I understood it, it's also much more promising than just, transferring some property title. And I think this can be connected to something else that you engage with, which is this question of subjectivity. We already pointed towards this topic early on. And in one of your texts, you write about this notion of fossil subjectivity, and you try to point out that the way in which we relate to the world with regard to fossil capital, let's say, or this mode of production, that this runs much deeper than just the everyday tools that might hold some type of, oil in it or whatever it is in a given case, but that the way in which we think about ourselves, specifically with regard to also a way of security and or security in terms of existence, is so deeply enmeshed with this notion of fossil subjectivities that it's really, really, really difficult to disentangle those, and that we will, at least that's how I understand why you pointed out that we will have to think about these subjectivities in a different way. Also, I would say including not merely pointing towards, I don't know, lifestyles that can be criticized because they are entangled with this fossil capitalist way of living, because we are all enmeshed in it, and that we have to think about how to become different subjects collectively and individually in a different way if we want to kind of get to a place of a different mode of relating to the world, so to speak. I mean, this kind of sounds a bit pathetic if I say that, but I totally got the point that you, I think you tried to make. Yeah. So maybe you could elaborate on this idea of fossil subjectivity and what might lie beyond it.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing this up. So this is kind of work in progress. This kind of thing I'm working on called Carbon and Civilization, in which I try to use Marcuse and Freud to think about, what is it that forms the kind of reality principle in which we live, to use this kind of Freudian language. And what in Freud's account, human beings are repressive. They're fundamentally modern human subjects require repression of our drives to function in a state of scarcity. We cannot just live out our pleasures all the time. We need to repress certain things so that we can adapt to conditions of scarcity, to develop a division of labor, and to meet our needs collectively. And this allows for productivity to arise, but it also frustrates our drives, which then requires compensation through other means, right? And this is the source of our perpetual unhappiness. Marcuse historicizes this account and says, not all repression is functional for civilization. There's surplus repression, right? There's kinds of things that we don't need to repress in order to manage in a civilization, right? In a division of labor. So I just picked up on this idea and tried to say, okay, it's a very simple question. Are fossil fuels, are the use of fossil fuels in our basic, social reproduction, everyday life, are they part of our basic repression or are they part of our surplus repression, right? Are they necessary for who we see ourselves as, or are they superfluous, right? Can it just be cut off without any change? And I find this a really difficult question, right, to think about. So let's say on the one hand, let's say it's superfluous, let's say it's surplus. Let's say the repression of fossil fuels is surplus. That means we could just simply change the source of our energy and carry on as usual. And therefore we cut off the kind of domination and we've replaced it with something that allows us to flourish and not harm each other. And I guess that is that is one of the projects of kind of liberal left, right? To say we just need to change the supply, and carry on, and we can carry on with our understanding of freedom, our understanding of security. This energy source is itself just indifferent, right? There's nothing inside fossil fuels that itself, right? It's a social relation that gives it its powers over us. Now, my worry with this argument is that so many parts of our self-understanding, our conception of freedom, right? The freedom to move, our conception of security, right, in a home, with cars, with certain our sense of choice in terms of fabrics that we choose or products that we were able to choose from, or our ability to move through cities, to get certain goods to each other on a certain time scale, to travel. All these things are mediated by kind of the circulation of fossil fuels, right? And I think you cannot just kind of replacing the on-off switch between fossil energy and renewable energy. It's just not so simple. According to Václav Smil, this energy historian or energy expert, this is a century-long project, which many people don't want to hear. Maybe he's exaggerating. But the extraction of fossil fuel sources is so, I think, is a difficult and serious project that will then affect all these self-conceptions that were built upon it. And that then, since these self-conceptions of, let's say, what it means to be a free fossil subject that can move throughout the urban environment or through a rural environment mediated by all these fossil products, since transforming that will then transform those conceptions that rely on top of it. Oh, I cannot just move. I cannot just do things all the time. I need to rethink about the effects of my actions on others, on nature. That will then challenge my ego. I think challenge my self-conception. And if my self-conception is truly based on this repression, then that will lead to kinds of aggressive reactions to defend my fossil subjectivity, to defend my ego against those who want to change it. And if you don't think about that, then attempts to transform our energy existence without understanding the subjective barriers and the subjective support systems that allow for it will just cause, I think, hard, destructive outbursts, scapegoating, violence. In one text I call it ecofascism, which is kind of this resentment from below, or climate barbarism, which is this kind of border management, this xenophobia from above. Now, I don't think this is the only task, is to think about, all these values and self-understandings that will come from a transition. What I call the objective task, right? The economic task is just as important, of course, defeating fossil capital as the major players who invested in all these energy sources for their own profit is, of course, necessary, but it's one side of the equation. And I think the critique of that we don't need to think about this because it's just consumers is just too easy. I think, which sometimes I also do, right? We don't need to think about consumer changes because you change the production system and the consumption needs will just follow. It's kind of the way it goes. I just think that could be very dangerous, and we're seeing that happen already now. Of course, the Gilets jaunes is a classic example of what happens when people feel, or when the green transitions are couched in class terms. It immediately causes a reaction because people's needs feel threatened, maybe rightfully so. Right? So I don't want to ignore this aspect in the future, this fossil subjectivity. I think it needs to also decline. Right? It needs to be managed in a certain way. And one way to think about it is, okay, what would it mean for all these capacities, all these abilities we have as fossil subjects to just sit in our homes and use all these fossil products all day long? What would it mean to transform that into kinds of labors of repair, or labors of solidarity, or labors of transformation towards a renewable economy, a renewable or post-fossil world? That could be joyful. That could be worthwhile, right? That could be new kinds of activities in which, not just like nature activities, not just going into the woods, but like, maybe repairing solar panels can be or repairing wind turbines can be, or repairing kinds of technology, or transforming our housing systems or our transport systems can be a way of managing this decline of one subjectivity into another one, funneling it into something non-destructive, non-lethal, non-harmful, right? But something has to be done, or I think it will explode. It'll come out and explode in violence against other people. So that's why conceptions of care are important here. To me, I use psychoanalytic terms here, but there are other frameworks you could use to understand this process of what needs to be done to to care for this, to let down this kind of subjectivity that we've become.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, at least my intuition would be, and this is a slightly materialist take, I guess. My intuition would be, I mean, the first thing to do would be that we have to enter into this discussion with an offer of security. So that's kind of the basis upon which to have this discussion. So if we enter with the promise of existential security for everybody, something that can be gained realistically, then this is already, this I think forms a good basis for this kind of discussion. It will still be a difficult discussion because also there is a libidinal aspect to destruction as well. And this is something also, this is something interesting that is not really being tackled on the left, I guess, because,
Can you say more about that?
Well, I mean, for example, there are these, there's a word for it, but I forgot it. There are people who like deliberately take out the mechanism in their trucks with making the trucks less ecologically harmful, and they take them out in order to show that they don't give a fuck, and then I don't know. They have these motor parades or whatever, and just deliberately harming the climate more just to stick it in your face, So there is and also, I mean, in some regards, the some elements of the offer on the right, they source their attractiveness coming from a place of I don't give a fuck, and having a even like hedonistic element to it in a certain sense, So there is a libidinal aspect with regard to this not giving a fuck and being destructive, and this also needs to be channeled into something else. And my intuition would be that it cannot just be channeled into something nice, but it needs to be channeled into something that is still nasty but not destructive. Maybe play, maybe some fighting, which has a ritual aspect to it, or I don't know. Something needs to be invented where this aspect of libidinal destruction can be channeled into, and not having it out in the open, fucking things up. Well,
I think that's great. People maybe want their surplus repression, right? They can't just
but in a different way.
I think you're in a different way. And I think you're right. Material security is kind of a baseline of why would anyone want to transition or transform their societies if it's less secure than the present? I think it's just obvious. So material security of those who are so insecure now, so precarious, would be something that would But how do you get that material security? What does that mean? Is then the kind of the question that arises next. How do you allow for basic needs to be met, but without denying the desire for participation, for activity, for play, for destruction? I don't think these are insolvable problems, though. All right. I think, like you said, there are outlets. Think about therapy itself, right? Therapy is a way of acting out sometimes your fantasies, but in a non-harmful setting, right? You're able to discuss it with someone, all the things that you can't. That if you did discuss it somewhere else, it could harm people. Are there settings like that or classrooms? In classrooms, you're able to talk about things you can't just talk about sometimes. There are kind of spaces in which you can play out different versions of ourselves. Why not have those all around society, right? And and how do you incorporate that into, how do you channel, how do you make that part of this socializing, right? I think there are opportunities here for rethinking, what what we do with our time, right? How we spend it, what gives us pleasure. I mean, I don't know if like watching football is going to go away or something, or monster car races, or but there are ways of allowing the drives that constitute our subjectivity to not be constantly frustrated and denied, and therefore forced into violent and harmful outlets. And that's the project, that's the task, right? To find these, to develop them in ways that can be, I don't want to say productive, but let's say non-harmful. They could also be useless, right? There's no problem with making a society that's mostly useless to me. I'm fine being purposeless.
I wanted to pick up on something that you mentioned before and bring it into a broader context, because you spoke about, I guess, something like the green capitalist vision of society as a project of the liberal left. And I would like to hear your take on how this, in a very broad sense, let's say liberalism, relates to what you term climate barbarism and eco-fascism, for that matter. So I mean, we're living in a very interesting time, let's say, in that regard, because something is becoming much more obvious now, I guess. And I think it has to do with this constellation, how climate barbarism, ecofascism, fascism, and liberalism intersect, and how they bring each other about. And I would be interested in your take on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think now we can be clear that Trumpism, climate barbarism, this total rejection of the need to transform and adapt to a post-fossil fuel world, that these aren't really, I would say, breaks with liberalism. At least mainstream liberalism, political liberalism, economic liberalism, there wasn't really much effort or projects beyond some UN meetings or some COP conferences or some discussions in some banks, or there wasn't really much done, I would say, to really push towards this this project that a lot of people thought was coming, which was a green capitalist world. There were some ideas that if we make some tax breaks here or there, or some subsidies here or there, that the economy would the market would in itself transition. It would find out the best sources, and it just needs a little prodding from the side, right? But it's just not profitable, right? It's just not really profitable yet, without industrial policy or state planning, or real kind of limits to kinds of industries. So when this reaction comes along and says, you know what, we want to rip up all these climate agreements and expand drilling, I mean, I think we shouldn't be so surprised and shocked as if this is a real turnaround. I mean, drilling has been occurring under Biden as well. I mean, in Europe as well. It's not like fossil fuel production is going down, really. Sometimes it plateaus. Renewable energies rise on top of it. They get added. They don't substitute fossil fuels. So I would see this on a spectrum. right? And Climate Leviathan, which Mann and Wainwright talk about, or this kind of liberal project of developing a green capitalist world, which is done basically to maintain hegemony of the G8, is one way of thinking about it. To do it in a way that doesn't threaten profits, or that doesn't lead to chaos too much, kind of the status quo. Well, even this mention, somehow, even the idea that things need to be changed can be tacked on, can be grabbed by opponents or by people on the far right who say, you know what, they want to destroy our way of life. It's so funny, even Trump is still, or Musk, are still talking about the Green New Deal, which didn't really exist. I mean, in practice, right? They're still talking about, these things that were just imagined. And they use this as a way to justify expanding fossil fuels and, like you said, rejecting and disrupting any agreements towards a kind of green capitalist future. That said, I don't know. I mean, sometimes it depends on the day, but sometimes I think green capitalism is inevitable. I know, like Andreas Malm would say the opposite, it doesn't exist at all. But sometimes I think it's just, I don't see how it can not happen in the long term. That doesn't mean it's happening now or it's happening yet, but there could be barbaric and fascistic paths towards green capitalism as well. I mean, one thing that I learned a lot recently about, or that's kind of opened my eyes a bit, is that even green capitalist projects are so tied in with military and security projects worldwide, with securing critical minerals, securing raw materials in certain industries. Some critical raw minerals, they're labeled critical because you think they're critical for like lithium batteries, but they're also critical for security in making weapons, making missiles. The same minerals, right? Like niobium. So I think this kind of green capitalist security nexus is also very clear. And I'm not sure that what's happening now with this kind of retreat, with this anti-climate movement, will even delay that, right? Now, in terms of ideology, though, right, there's this, it creates, or it facilitates this bottom-up, I would say, eco-fascist resentment, which is this hatred of this desire to protect one's resources against others and to act out kinds of white supremacist violence on others, sometimes with ecological backgrounds, to protect our nature from outsiders. But I don't know. I mean, with so much wildfires and floods and such chaotic weather systems, I'm now not sure if ecofascism and green capitalism are even antithetical anymore. Like I just don't know. I think before, in the pre-2019, maybe 10 years ago, they looked like different options, right? Those climate leviathans, one option, and now I'm just not sure that they're all separate options anymore. They're more like tendencies that arise in the present and play off each other. I mean, it's just, sometimes we forget that Musk is the owner of the biggest electronic automobile company in the world, who's supporting Trump to remove charging stations, like electric charging stations. Like, he wants to remove the subsidies for these charging stations. So there's just a lot of chaos. I mean, there's a lot of inconsistency and contradiction, and I'm not sure if it's so contradictory anymore, or if it's so unimaginable anymore that we could have eco-fascist tendencies, climate barbarous tendencies, and green capitalist tendencies all at the same time, coexisting in a chaotic world system. That if there's no project to manage this or to socialize this, and this will just coexist at a certain level. That's kind of my thinking now on the topic. Who knows how I feel in a couple of years,
or in a week, for that matter.
Yeah.
Very interesting. Before we get to the final question, I wanted to ask you about a sentence in the Managing Decline text. And you say, or you write there, and I quote you, possibly the normalization of the decline of capitalism, previously a precondition for the belief in socialism, has exhausted itself in the exhaustion of the future itself. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah. There used to be this kind of belief that that capitalism builds its own gravediggers, right? That capitalism has already exhausted its productive capacity, and it's already in decline. This is, at least from around World War I, and that, but that this belief that there's a collapse inherent to capitalism. This wasn't seen as somehow letting people off the hook, which is now we think of this kind of automatism, this economistic. Oh, capitalism's so it's a crisis theory, right? It's so crisis-ridden that it will collapse. This doesn't mean that socialists or activists or Marxists or communists do nothing. It rather gives them the background conditions in which they can act. And I think this is hard for us to understand now, right? Because we say, oh, that's just quietism, right? The economy does it for them. And I say, no, that's not how people thought about it in the 1910s and 20s. If you read their writings, if you read like Luxemburg even, who believes in a kind of the barbaric, collapsing tendencies of capitalism, which then is the precondition for intervening to transform it into something positive, right? Because if you don't transform it into something positive, into socialism, into something constructive, it'll decline in ways that are barbaric, right? That are destructive and harmful. So this kind of collapse theory is kind of it helps us. It reminds us, okay, yes, this is possible. It's collapsing. Let's create something better. This idea, I think, is now, or this kind of theory is now dead in a sense, right? Not many people believe that capitalism will collapse like by itself, or it'll fall apart by itself, I think, right? And I think one reason, or one way of thinking about one reason that people don't believe in this anymore is that this may sound strange, but I don't think people really believe in the future anymore. except on Future Histories. But even, right? I think there is this is a slogan from these movements I was a part of like 15 years ago. It was against the cancellation of the future. Right, against the absent future, which was this movement against kind of debt, and debt is a way of canceling the future, right? It's a way of subjecting people to work in the future, canceling their possibilities. So debt, or high rents, or wages, or this idea that people's livelihood will get better over time, progress, seems to be, I think, canceled exhausted, in a certain sense. It's not taken for granted that our children will be better off than us, right? That's a kind of a new phenomenon, at least in like the affluent West. So that was the content of the future. The future was the future in the sense of something different than the present, right? For many people, a future is just kind of limiting the harms. The best that the future can offer is just kind of limiting the harms of the present, maybe going backwards to something previous, something greater, some greater time of America or Europe. And the task, I think, for us is we cannot rely on this collapse theory anymore, but we still need to have a vision of the future. So we need to rebuild the future, in a sense, right? Rebuild the meaning of the future, that the future can be different. It can be possible to have a future that's not just a repetition of the same. That we can imagine a future in the first place, I think is difficult. And just dealing with your day-to-day lives, with climate change, with the kinds of events that are happening on a world scale after the financial crisis, it just seems hard to imagine that you could even plan a future when you can't even plan next week. And if you can't plan a future, though, then why would you even struggle for anything beyond the present? So yeah, that's the task, rebuilding the future.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I'm not sure if this is the best or the worst bridge into my last question, which is, Jacob, if you think about the future, what makes you joyful?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, the obvious answer is like, my kids, just playing, enjoying time, wonder, space with them. But that's a very easy private nuclear family answer, right? And I don't know, being joyful. I mean, parents can also be evil. I don't know if this is the right, where I want to go, but joy, you could also have joy in bad ways. Joy can also, like you said before, right? There can be libidinal destruction. I remember reading Stephen Markley's book, The Deluge, and he talks about, he's like, he talks about parents, and it's parents that commit genocide. It's parents that commit ecocide, right? People want to protect their kids from outsiders. They want to protect their kids from violence. So they do violence to protect those they love, right? So I don't want to, I think joy is tricky, right? Because you could have joy in doing things that are actually harmful and destructive. But what gives me a joy, like beyond that, I mean, I'm joyful. Here, I'll give you just something that I'm thinking about. I'm very happy and very joyful when I understand the world better, right? And that means I'm joyful when I kind of read and I discuss new theories. It's a very theoretical answer, but I'm really joyful when the world comes into view. When the world comes into view to me through kind of a framework, through a kind of understanding, and I think there's so much chaos, like so much incomprehension right now, in terms of the present and the past and the future, that I am truly joyful that there is going to be, and there is being developed, theories, critical theories or social theories, or just theories for self-understanding, right? I think there's just so much expansion of people reading and discussing and understanding and trying to make the world a better place, that the kinds of theories that are being developed and that will be developed are going to be illuminating, like literally enlightening for us. And that enlightenment, I think, is a kind of true joy that I feel, that I will feel.
Wonderful. Jacob, thank you so much for being part of Future Histories.
Thank you, Jan.
That was our show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. If you want to support Future Histories, you can do so on Patreon. For this, visit patreon.com/futurehistories, or you can simply tell a friend that you liked the show and that he, she, or they might like it as well. Thanks a lot, and hear you in 2 weeks.